The Alberta panel begins this week in Red Deer. Also, Pierre Poilievre's by-election coming up in August. So much to talk about in provincial politics. And with that, here is Tyler Dawson of the National Post. Tyler, great to have you with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Tyler, Pierre Poilievre recently went on record saying that he's pro-Canada and disagrees with Alberta separation. So this may have angered the separatists out there, but should this come as a surprise to anyone?
I don't really think so. I mean, you don't generally run to be prime minister of a country if you support breaking it apart. So no, I don't think it's a surprise at all. I think that people have interpreted that perhaps as him saying that he doesn't understand Alberta's concerns or understand that Alberta wants a little bit more power in confederation, something like that. But I don't think anyone should be shocked that the leader of the official opposition is saying that he is a Canadian patriot. But of course, he's running for by-election here in Alberta in a rural riding, a very, very conservative riding. And generally, you tend to see a little bit higher rates of separatist sentiment in conservative areas. So you can imagine that he's going to come up against, a few headwinds here, possibly. I don't think any of it is going to be significant enough to affect the outcome of this. But certainly, you did have a bunch of separatist leaders and politicians this week saying, this is proof that the Conservative Party of Canada is irrelevant to Alberta's interests, that Pierre Poilievre doesn't care about Alberta, that he just cares about power. These kinds of sentiments are the sort of thing that's come up this week since he went on record about this. But, he has in the past been a little bit skeptical of some of these sort of pro-Alberta moves. People might remember when he spoke out against the idea of an Alberta pension plan, when he spoke out against Alberta leaving the Canada pension plan to create its own pension scheme. So this is in no way is this unusual or a change in character for Poilievre. In no way should this be a surprise. But, nevertheless, some of the separatist folks out there are making a little bit of noise about it.
Okay, so you're not thinking it's going to cause many challenges in that by-election. All right.
No.
Yeah. Okay. So Alberta's opposition party's leader officially now has a seat in the legislature. So Naheed Nenshi officially was sworn in this week. And he's kind of gone on record as to say he wants to be the pro-Canada politician in Alberta. So it looks like he's going to start up something to counter the Alberta panel. What's that all about, Tyler?
Yeah, so the UCP government has announced the Alberta Next panel, which is touring the province and discussing all these issues that, could increase Alberta's power within the federation. And Naheed Nenshi is really trying to cast himself as the pro-Canada candidate here, the pro-Canada potential premier. A lot of the criticism of the way that Premier Danielle Smith has handled the issue in the last year or so has been that she's sort of amping up separatist elements, not tamping down on separatist elements in the same way that former Premier Jason Kenney did when he was in power. People are maybe coming close to suggesting that she's a closet separatist. These are not things that I think are necessarily true, but certainly there's the perspective out there that this government is pretty cozy with really angry Albertans and perhaps some people who are straight up separatists. So you can imagine that creates a little bit of political room for the NDP to say, no, we're not those people. We don't believe in separation. We believe that Canada is stronger with Alberta in it, and Alberta is stronger as a part of Canada. And they can create a little bit of political room there. So what they are planning on doing is having this panel that will sort of tour the province at the same time as the Alberta Next panel, and just sort of hearing the grievances that Albertans have, probably a very different segment of Albertans than you can imagine are going to the UCP hosted panels, and also discussing ways that Canada and Alberta might be better together. So, I think to some extent, I think it's a savvy political move, actually. The NDP needs to find new territory. It needs to find new things to talk about in order to win more voters, to instead of just building up, its core of supporters that it has. It's going to need to reach across the aisle to some extent, to some of the old PC voters, to some of the Alberta Party voters that maybe went UCP in the last couple of elections, maybe some of the soft conservative supporters in, suburban sort of areas that like some stuff the UCP is doing but don't like the other things. And they can't do that by talking about some of the stuff they traditionally really, really like to bang on about, healthcare being the perfect example. You can't, how many elections, right, has the Alberta NDP made public health care sort of a central core tenet of their pitch for re-election, and it hasn't worked since 2015. So they need to be looking for something new, and I think that this is as good a topic as any for Naheed Nenshi to try and really sink his teeth into and sway some Alberta voters over to his side of things.
And speaking of the Alberta panel there, the first iteration was held Tuesday evening in Red Deer. Tyler, what happened there at that meeting?
Well, pretty much what you'd expect. I mean, Alberta's nobody's, or Red Deer, sorry, is nobody's idea of a liberal city. So it does seem like most of the few hundred supporters that came out, or speakers that came out, or interested people that came out, were sort of on the more conservative side of the spectrum. You know, you had people there who were certainly boosting separation as an option for Alberta, as something that they believe in. You certainly had some saying that the government should just go ahead with some of the ideas that it's proposed and not put it to a referendum. For reference, this panel is looking at several of the same things that other panels have looked at in the past. You had a Ralph Klein panel back in, I think, 2004. You had the Fair Deal panel in 2019, 2020 with Jason Kenney. Some of these are pretty old issues, you know, whether that's looking at equalization, the Alberta pension plan, and Alberta police force. These are old issues. Some of them have quite high support in some areas among some voters. None of them are overall particularly popular with Albertans writ large, though. That doesn't seem to have been the case on Tuesday night, though, and there did seem to be some enthusiasm for that based on the news reports that I've seen. Now, the big thing I think that's lingering in all of this is Premier Daniel Smith is basically calling for the Constitution to be reopened and renegotiated. That's something that hasn't happened since, I think, 1992. Would be incredibly complicated. Would possibly not go very well for anybody concerned. Might not go well for Alberta. You know, there's obviously constitutional amendments that Alberta wants, but that other provinces aren't going to want. Other provinces might want things that are inimical to Alberta's interests. So super complicated proposal, but certainly one of the more interesting ones. You know, we've talked a lot about the pension plan over the last couple of years. We've talked a lot about the police force. It's kind of interesting to consider what constitutional negotiations might look like. But anyways, that's a roundabout way of saying that the first one was in Red Deer. There will be other ones around the province, so if people are interested in attending, they should keep their eye out. And I do think that you would see a slightly different tone in, say, Edmonton or Calgary than you might in somewhere like Red Deer, where you are sort of the catchment areas, lots of these very small conservative towns, right? So I think, you know, for as interesting as it is to see what work is being done while this panel sort of on the road, it'll be the final report that comes out of it that will really tell us where this government is heading.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned healthcare there earlier, Tyler.
Mm-hmm.
And Alberta now has over 1,300 measles cases. It's the highest number in Canada, and it's more than the entire United States, which is actually really hard to sort of wrap your head around. But it looks like it's just due to a number of people not being vaccinated or parents not vaccinating their kids. So, Tyler, what's going on with our province here?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I think there's about 1,288 cases in the United States and 1,312 or something like
Right?
that in
Like,
Alberta. And
what?
it's nuts. I mean, keep in mind that the United States, of course, has a population that's 85 times the population of Alberta. So it's a really remarkable number. The one bright spot is that Alberta has not had any deaths yet, and the United States has had a couple this year from measles. But as you say, it does seem to be largely vaccination. You know, you need a relative. Measles is incredibly contagious. It's maybe the most contagious sort of viral illness that humans can have. I recall reading an expert on that a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago now, and it obviously is going to thrive when there are people who are unvaccinated and are going to fall sick and spread it onwards. And of course, that 1,312 cases, those are only the ones that have been detected and diagnosed in a lab. There could, of course, be hundreds, perhaps thousands more circulating in the province, and people are just not sick enough to have sought out the healthcare system. So we just don't know. Yeah, it does seem to be vaccination, sort of full stop. So there's calls for people to really get their kids vaccinated before they return to school. There's calls for the government to maybe do something like it did with COVID vaccines, have vaccination centers, try and reduce some of the barriers necessary to getting vaccinated. But otherwise, I guess we'll see where it goes. The cases are probably going to continue to rise, unfortunately, and I guess we can all just hope that it doesn't lead to any tragic outcomes.
Oh, exactly. Switching gears here, or bike gears. Remember, not all that long ago, there was a real push for bike lanes in municipalities. Well, it looks like now the province is sort of saying that municipalities should remove these bike lanes, and it's based on, I guess, the amount of pushback that they're hearing from people and how these bike lanes are impeding the cars, I guess, and the roadways in cities. So What's going to happen, Tyler? Can the province actually tell cities and municipalities to get rid of your bike lanes? I don't know that they have jurisdiction over that. Are they going to withhold funding? How is this going to look?
Well, yeah, it's all very confusing and complicated. The province does have some jurisdiction over provincial roadways. So you think the Deerfoot through Calgary, for example, it is a provincial highway. That's not the case in sort of downtown Edmonton or downtown Lethbridge necessarily. So it is the infrastructure. The jurisdiction over the infrastructure is a little bit confusing. And so to some extent, I think what they're doing here is just sort of using the bully pulpit and saying that, we've heard from people who are upset about bike lanes, reducing traffic lanes, reducing parking lanes. We're going to make a stink about it publicly in hopes that that pressures municipal politicians to do something about it in some fashion. Of course, we saw in Toronto a few months ago where the provincial legislature actually legislated a bike lane removal on Toronto's Bloor Street. So you can imagine perhaps this is where we're headed in Alberta. I don't know that, but I think it's a possibility. Bike lanes are unpopular. Bike lanes are unpopular among a certain segment of voters, and the UCP needs to make some serious inroads in Edmonton in particular, and in parts of Calgary to hold on to power in the next election. And they also might genuinely think that bike lanes are bad and that more traffic lanes is better for traffic. So, a bunch of stuff circulating here, but they're sort of reviewing bike lanes, these quote unquote problem bike lanes. But what does that mean? What does that mean they'll do? What is the outcome of all that? All those questions are very unclear. But to some extent, this is a clash between sort of conservative conservative suburban car driving values and sort of more liberal urban bike riding
Right.
values, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, because I was going to say, it seems kind of almost the opposite. Most politicians seem to want to push for more physical activity, things that are better for the environment. And here we have just an about face. But it sounds like maybe they're just listening to all the complaints that are coming in. And perhaps there might have been some better planning by the cities and municipalities before putting in these bike lanes.
Certainly, there could always be better planning. I don't know if anyone's going to dispute that one.
Tyler, Alberta is rolling out new regulations this fall, barring transgender women from competing in women's sports. But it won't apply to those who come from outside the province because they're bound by other provincial laws or rules of organization. So what will this actually look like?
Well, it's a great question because it's kind of unclear, isn't it? If an organization hosts an event in Lethbridge and athletes come from outside of the province and they're not bound by these rules, what are those rules really doing? So this is for women's amateur sports essentially, and it does seem like it will affect competition in Alberta, but for these out of province athletes, it won't really apply. So I do think there's a big question mark over what it is going to mean at the end of the day. And some sporting organizations are sort of scratching their heads about it too and saying that, the main outcome of this for us might just be that we don't host interprovincial or international events in Alberta because we can't guarantee the participation of everybody, or everyone will participate and people will be upset about it. So very confusing situation, but certainly it does seem like it'll affect sort of local tournaments, local amateur tournaments and things like that in Alberta itself with Alberta athletes. But I guess, the rules are written and all that. I suppose we'll see more once it's actually in effect what happens then.
Yeah, it should be interesting, that's for sure. Tyler Dawson, our legislative correspondent with the National Post. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.